This is Stories from the Hackery, a podcast about the students, alumni, and community members that continue to shape Nashville Software School. Nashville Software School is the nation's first nonprofit coding boot camp where a person with aptitude and motivation can gain the skills needed for a career in tech. For more information, visit us at nashvillesoftwareschool.com. Today, our guest on Stories from the Hackery is Brandon Valentine. Brandon is one of the most long-standing community supporters of NSS. Was the first development manager at a tech company in Nashville that actually stuck his hand up and said, well, that sounds like an interesting idea. Let's get it a whiteboard and sort of noodle this thing. And yeah, we'd be willing to interview, assuming that the curriculum covered certain sort of skills. Wouldn't necessarily hire, but we'll certainly interview. We're looking for talent. And from that, which was early 2012, I think, maybe even late 2011, Brandon's been engaged with Nashville Software School ever since. His stories changed and evolved, just as NSS has had. So I want to welcome Brandon Valentine to the podcast. And Brandon, give us your personal elevator pitch. Who is Brandon Valentine these days?
Okay. Hi. Thank you, John. That was a very kind introduction. You and I have known each other 12, 13 years now, and it's been quite a journey to get here. At the moment that you and I met, and I think probably what most of Nashville would know me from, I was at the time the development manager at CenterSource, but over the years eventually became the managing partner there and had a big part in our story over 7+ years. And early on, you and I met, and I had the opportunity to get involved with NSS. And from there, I think in many ways, the success of CenterSource in those years was intertwined with the success at the NSS. We hired from the very first graduating class 2 developers and kept that up for quite a number of years. And I got a chance to see firsthand the impact we were having, got a chance to sort of funnel back to you feedback on the curriculum and the program and what we needed to do to really serve our students well. But I think maybe a lot of folks in Nashville don't know sort of where I came from before that and what my background is. So I'll spend a couple minutes on that and then maybe catch you up on where I am today. Cool. But before CenterSource, my very first job in tech actually was in the teaching world. So I grew up around a really important person in my life, my grandmother, who herself was absolutely brilliant. She was the youngest child of a sharecropping family in a small rural community in Alabama, who was the first person in her family to graduate high school, college. She drug all of her siblings through at least a GED. So she was a teacher at heart from the beginning. And that culminated in her having a 30+ year teaching career in public schools. She eventually ran the math department for a school district. And just throughout all of that was this really positive influence in my life who showed me the value of education, of teaching. And she started 2 software companies in her life.
Cool.
So she also taught me how to program, which is pretty amazing. I don't think a lot of people, in particular of my generation, would tell you that their grandmother taught them how to program, but mine did. And her second software company was actually a software company that taught mathematics to high school students who were struggling with it so that they could pass their standardized tests. This is the era of the No Child Left Behind Act and things like that. And so I literally was a 14-year-old high school freshman writing software to teach other kids in school mathematics. And so that taught me not only how to program, but it taught me the math quite well. And I learned sort of early on that kind of the best way to learn something was to figure out how to teach it to someone else. And so I took those lessons with me into my career, and my very first job out of high school, actually not even out of high school. So in the summer between my junior and senior year, I started to work at Vanderbilt University there in Nashville and got involved in research computing and had a ton of opportunities thrown my way by people who were in a position to extend those opportunities to me and believed that I could go do them as an 18-year-old nobody, right? And so I think from that background and from all that trust that all these people placed in me over the years, all of the opportunities to teach myself something, figure it out, go get something done, when you approached me with the idea for the NSS, it just sort of fell into place. Like this is aligned with my life and my story and how I got here. And if there's some way that I can be involved in creating that opportunity for someone else, well, why wouldn't I do that? Right? It only cost me time and effort and early on, probably a little bit of money, but but money well spent, right? And so I think that's kind of the origin of how I got connected with NSS and with you and why I've stuck around for so long, which I think we'll probably talk about as we get further into this conversation. And so CenterSource, that story ended. It's been about 5-6 years ago now, depending on how you time that. And so I took a couple of years off, which was good for me. It's something that is sort of a privilege to be able to do that in your career before going to GitHub. And I've actually spent from late 2019 until April of this year inside of the biggest developer tools company on the planet. So that is something that I'm very proud of. And I built a great team there of consultants teaching other developers how to use our tools. So our platform, Git itself, and quite recently Copilot, which is, I think, a thing we're gonna talk about quite a bit today. And so in April of this year, I left and I'm currently enjoying my summer off. It's coming to an end here. We had our first snow on Monday.
Oh, did you really?
We did. And that's maybe a nice segue to tell folks who haven't caught up with me in a while that I'm no longer in Nashville. So I left Nashville in late 2019 to move to Brooklyn to date and then marry my now wife, Julia. Julia is herself a really talented, brilliant engineer. She was employee number 100 at GitHub and had a huge hand in building that company into what it became. And so she was living in Brooklyn and I was living in Nashville, and we had to pick one. And it was time for a change for me. So New York it was. That lasted about a year. And then something happened in 2020. I don't know if you remember that, John.
What could that have been?
Yeah.
Oh, gee.
Yeah. So, she and I, through our time dating each other, had discovered a favorite vacation spot in upstate New York, way upstate New York. I think that Tennesseans may not realize that New York is as tall as Tennessee is wide. So New York City to where I live in Saranac Lake, New York, is about like driving from Memphis to Mountain City. It's quite a drive, but we do have excellent Amtrak service up here. So a bit of a different situation than you would have in Tennessee. But I now live in the heart of the Adirondack Mountains, which the Adirondack Park is 6 million acre nature preserve in upstate New York. If you look at a map of New York, it looks like there's nothing here. And that's because there is nothing here. There are very few roads, very little infrastructure. It's a beautiful place to live. We mountain bike and ski and really love our life up here. And so that's where I am today.
Cool. So keeping with the as tall as Tennessee is long, if you turn Tennessee on end and made Memphis New York City, which sounds like a setup for some good jokes, but I won't go there. So you basically live in the middle of the Great Smoky Mountain National Park. I do.
So, that's a good analogy.
Yeah. Very cool.
Yeah.
The only flaw in the whole thing I could see, Brandon, is that thing you said a minute ago. We've already had our first snow of the season.
It is freezing here today. It's not snowing, but it is freezing.
Oh, wow. Well, we're actually having our first true fall kind of cold spell. Mm-hmm. I don't think it got out of the 50s yesterday, and it was down, I think, in the 30s last night. Upper 30s, but, still. Yeah. When my dog went out this morning, she was like, what the heck? So and the flannel came out of the closet. This is the first flannel sighting of the season. So, well, yeah. So lots of changes for you personally, professionally, everything in the years since we marked the start of time, 2012, NSS one.
Okay.
So, and as you said, we do want to talk some about Copilot. We want to talk about generative AI, the changes that are or maybe aren't, who knows, underway in the state of software engineering as a profession, driven by, I think, generative AI, but also lots of other things. Because as you said, you were at the middle of the largest software development tools company in the world, and really critical infrastructure underlying, right, all the rest of everybody's development stack and whatever language, whatever, right? So GitHub is in a not a unique position, but one of a select few companies that's really got their finger on the pulse of a lot of the things that are going on in the world of software development. And I think we do want to sort of talk about that, right? Because it's been 12 years since the start of NSS. Technology is an industry. Software it's not a world that stands still. But we do go through these sort of periodic sort of unlock, disrupt, relock sort of phases where lots of things change and then things settle down for a few years, right? Yeah, there's changes at the margin, right? I mean, we did a big unlock with the internet, right? In the early, arguably late 90s to early 2000s. And then we sort of relocked again, I don't know, you probably argue about when that happened, but 2008, 2009, 2010, somewhere in there, right? And yes, there have been changes. Arguably, PHP was the most popular internet application programming language back then. And then Ruby on Rails became a major thing. And Python was lurking around the edges, but Python's now become sort of this Swiss Army knife language that gets used for lots of things. And languages ebb and flow, and styles of programming ebb and flow, and the whole front end someday will settle down. But so we kind of wanted to talk a little bit about sort of trends and changes and things in software development as a whole. Maybe focus a little bit on trends and changes as they impact how people can get into the field, right? How do juniors get in today, right? Because it's, at least right now, as we record this, we're certainly 18 months into the slowest period of hiring for junior developers that we've seen in 20 years, since the kind of first internet bubble burst, right? Things started to slow down fourth quarter 2022 when the big tech companies all had massive layoffs, and those layoffs continued, but that cut across really the whole tech sector. But it's not just restricted to tech, lots of other industries, and I think for lots of reasons, and want to explore maybe some of what you've seen that may be causing some of that, including as it relates to what's changing in software engineering, sort of coincident with those tech companies having all the layoffs. But I don't think, certainly not a cause of those, was the real public release of ChatGPT and this whole, generation of code through LLM, large language model tools like ChatGPT, Claude, Gemini, and other tools layered on top of those. Like, I think of GitHub Copilot as layered on top of the LLM, for example, or Cursor, which was the flavor of the month last month. I don't know if it still is this month. So I want to talk about some of those things and how much those are changing the world, how developers should think about preparing for those, and not just juniors, right? But because I've certainly heard people say that we've got to upskill all of our developers basically, right, around these changing technologies, with maybe generative AI as the catalyst. I don't know, but I think it's all grist for the mill here for this discussion. So let me get off my soapbox there and ask you a question. So, start fairly broad, maybe from what you've experienced and observed. What's your sense of how much impact generative AI has had on the software engineering job market so far?
I think it's really tough at this moment to have a clear vision of what the long-term impact on the job market is going to be, though I do have some thoughts about that we can get to. But it's very clear that in the short term, it's upending the market in lots of ways that are maybe unhelpful. And I think we're still on the front side of the curve of AI adoption and rollout. And that is creating a lot of churn in the job market. It's not the only reason for the layoffs we're seeing, but it is a huge part of it. But maybe not for the reason that people would expect. I think people would expect that we are seeing these layoffs because CTOs, CIOs are saying, well, I can do more with less. Like fewer developers plus AI equals greater productivity. Sure, there are people out there who believe that's true. I actually, in my experience and in the CIOs and CTOs I've talked to over the last couple of years, I don't really find that is out there without a healthy dose of skepticism from those individuals. Like they are very much wait and see. We'll find out the extent to which that is true. What is happening is the market is very impatient with uncertainty. The market really loves for a company to make an earnings projection and then hit it or beat it, right? And this AI thing is really freaking expensive. The hardware you need to do it, whether you buy it yourself or you rent it from OpenAI or Microsoft or Google or whoever, that is a big bill. And so what you are seeing is that in order to buy themselves runway to figure out this whole AI thing and how it fits into their business and what the long-term impact of it will be, you're seeing a lot of businesses say, well, we've got to reduce operating expenses now so that we can make the capital bet on AI. And unfortunately, the fastest route at most of these companies to reduce operating expenses is to lay people off, is to cut salaries. That's always the biggest bucket. And I feel like that aspect of this has been missing from a lot of the conversations I've had, a lot of the articles I've read about the AI trend and about the layoffs in tech. And I think that more than anything is what's driving a lot of the job market insecurity right now. But the good news is I think that it's temporary. I think we're on the front side of that curve, but in a year or so here, we are going to crest it because companies who overcorrected, who laid off too many people and lost the productivity that they need to make their business successful are going to start to realize that. And I guess I could back up for a moment and say that productivity in software development is notoriously difficult to measure. Like anybody who tells you they can measure that is whether intentionally or not lying to you, right?
Yeah, that's been one of the prominent arguments in the field for the 50 plus years I've been here, right? Yeah. It's just let's measure lines of code. No, let's not.
Yeah. But over a long enough time scale, you can figure it out, right?
Yeah.
Oh, hey, the number of defects in our backlog has gone way up. The number of new features we've shipped has gone way down. Something is wrong here, right? And then a common story in tech, someone at the upper level notices that, goes to the development team and says, what's going on here? And they say, we told you last year not to let all those people go, right? And I think there's going to be a lot of that over the next year or two in tech. And so I think for people who are in the job market right now, who are thinking about going into this job market, enrolling at NSS and going on this journey with us, I feel like right now the key is just to hang on. Like, I don't think it's doom and gloom forever. I think it's doom and gloom for a very short time window while this stuff shakes out. And I think going back to what I said earlier about sort of the market's impatience, I think another thing that's different about this AI boom that during the earlier sort of web boom, web 2.0 boom, if you want to call it that, in 2008, 2009 and onward, is the analysts on Wall Street are a generation younger and a generation more tech savvy. And so they understand this boom in a way that sort of in previous tech booms, the Wall Street was very hands off with tech. There was a lot of sort of, well, interest rates are low, you guys are making profits, we're cool. And I think this go around, that's not the case. And you can see that Goldman released like a bombshell of a report about the lack of profits in the AI space, right? And that wouldn't have happened in the Web 2.0 era. It was very much the opposite, because the people at these rating firms, at these investment firms, they just didn't understand what was going on in the tech sector, and they do now. And so that's a bit of a mixed blessing for people who are in the tech sector, in that, there is going to be actual pressure from Wall Street on tech to make money, which in the long run is probably good. But in the short term, when you have a lot of uncertainty created by a new technology like this, we're going to go through churn in a way that we maybe didn't in the past.
Okay, great. Lots to chew on there. So let me come back to a couple of the points you made. So let me come back to the point you made about investments in generative AI infrastructure displacing personnel cost, right? So to free up the cash, that's led to some combination of layoffs and hiring freezes in tech companies. Let's come back to what kind of companies, right? Because I've seen, you're right, that is not in a lot of the discussion on this, but I have seen it in some of the discussion about this relative to certainly some of the tech companies who are trying to train their own models, because that's where a lot of this expense is, right? Is the training of these models. It's hundreds of millions of dollars at the current foundation model scales, I guess. So are you saying that you also are seeing that outside of the tech sector in, let's say, enterprise organizations that are making investments in generative AI, either investigative investments to try to figure out what it'll do for them, or actually trying to build and deploy models? Talk to me a little bit about that. Where is that displacement happening?
Yeah. So without sort of betraying confidentiality agreements and things like that, I can tell you that over the last 4+ years, I have largely been working in the banking sector and in the insurance sector. So the banking sector, some of the largest banks on the planet, literally the too big to fail banks, those were my customers. Some of the largest insurers in the United States. And what I have seen with those companies is that first of all, they're very top heavy in terms of the number of developers that they have on staff. Some of these large institutions could have 60,000 developers on staff.
Oh, yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So even the most sort of naive version of we're going to adopt AI is we're going to buy a Copilot license or a ChatGPT license or whatever tool they choose for 60,000 people, right? And so think about what that check looks like, right? That is a really big check.
Good to cash it. But
right. So you're going to write a check like that, you're going to go talk to the board of directors of the company. It's not it's not within your purview to just sign off on that. And that opens a negotiation, right? Which is, okay, well, if this is going to make you so much more productive, then in order to pay for this, what else are we going to cut? Where are we going to find savings? And so that's sort of a very natural thing to happen in business, and especially outside of tech. Like in tech, we may be look at productivity differently than they would in a non-tech company, though that's changing. Every company is becoming more of a tech company. So that's one dimension of it, right? Which is like, it literally is just a big check to write. It's a lot of money. How do we afford that? But another dimension of it is, sure, you might have a developer productivity tool. You might have like an Office Copilot type tool that you want some people in your organization to have. But a lot of these institutions are also building their own models, and they're building them internally, specifically because they relate to trade secrets or competitive advantages that these institutions have. You think about trading firms, if they want an LLM to help them with their high frequency trading platform and things like that, like nobody in the public eye is going to get anywhere near that. I tell the story sometimes, but I once was at an event with a guy from one of these banks who saw the photographer walking around, and he said, "I have to leave." He was not allowed to have his photo taken at this event, right? So there's a lot of secrecy around what's going on there, but there's big money being spent inside the institutions to train their own models, and that requires that they also get a hold of this expensive hardware, which, you know,
Right.
that in and of itself is, there's a race right now between Microsoft and Google and everyone else to own as much of that hardware as possible,
Yeah.
because the manufacturing capacity is limited.
Yeah.
So that's kind of the other dimension that's going on outside of tech, is these companies that realize, oh, maybe there is a way that our business becomes more competitive if we figure out how to use this well.
Right. So let me speculate that then it would make sense to me that that would be a trend that would show up in financial tech as fast as it shows up in the tech industry, software industry,
Mhm.
tech industry itself. Because fintech, big banks, hedge funds, those guys are basically tech companies, right? So that would make sense. It might also explain why, as it trickles down to somebody like us, we see some industries where their hiring doesn't seem to have been disrupted as much, but we also know they're going very slow and or not trying to build the models themselves, right? Because of some of those concerns about the models, like leaking data, privacy. Now, financial services on the consumer side in particular has got some of those issues with privacy for sure. So they've got their HIPAA type privacy regulations and stuff. Healthcare, I know, is very concerned as an industry about privacy security. Plus, you know, the potential consequences of a misdiagnosis or an LLM hallucination issue are much more catastrophic in the healthcare industry. So they're, like they are with a lot of technologies, they're going to be a slower adopter, even when they see big potential, which I think, again, that industry does. So it would make sense that it would be uneven across, the impacts of this would be uneven, particularly in this relatively early stage across industries. So that makes sense. Okay. So, all right. So that's another factor on the pile of why the layoffs, which I think we also are at a point in the economic cycle where lots of businesses would have been slowing down hiring anyways. Inflation, all of those. It's just one of those times when hiring slows down anyway, or when let's talk about new headcount for next year's budget after we know what's going to happen in the election or whatever the discussions are. Let's see what the Fed does now, right? So I think there's sort of a weird confluence here of this disruptive technology with the economic cycle and things. It's that cliche perfect storm kind of convergence of things, right? So, but you did make the point that you think this is temporary, whatever temporary means. And we've been saying that. I've been saying that based on just my perspective of 50 years in this industry, that it's temporary. Yeah. I don't believe people are I don't believe people are running out of problems to solve.
I think that's exactly how I would put it, John. So I feel very strongly that we're a bit distracted maybe by the promise of the LLM. And I think that there are certain things that will absolutely change forever and for the better. And that's wonderful, but it's not a panacea, right? And it's not going to solve all of our problems. And I think there will always be a market for people who know how to build technology and can reason about a business problem. And I think, if anything, the LLM makes those types of skills more valuable in the sense that the LLM may give you a starting point, but it doesn't reason about things. It makes inferences. And so there's always going to be a need for someone to code review that code, to debug that code, or even to modify it, right? That, like, it gives you a first draft. It doesn't give you a final draft. And I feel like we're starting to understand that now as an industry. Like, we're starting to wrap our heads around the fact that it's not just going to do the job. It's just going to make the job easier. And I think that is actually a positive development for junior developers in particular. I think I used to sort of, the folks from the NSS classes that I would mentor from cohort to cohort in the early days, a lot of them would ask me, like, what's actually the hardest part of being a developer? And my answer was almost always sitting down in front of a blank sheet of paper, right? So that's the most intimidating thing. And it's not just in software development. If you're an artist, you sit down to a blank canvas. If you're a musician, you sit down to a blank score. Getting started with any sort of creative endeavor, and I do believe that there's a lot of creativity in programming, that's intimidating. And so it's always easier to work on something that already exists, right? To go be a maintenance programmer, to fix bugs, like, because the code's already there. You just have to understand it and modify it. And I think the biggest positive thing for people getting into the industry is tools like Copilot are going to do that for you. They're going to give you somewhere to start. Even if the starting point is wrong, it removes that sort of indecision, that sort of difficulty getting started. And so I feel that, that's a positive aspect of this stuff, but it doesn't solve the whole problem. We still need people to reason about whether we're solving the right problem, whether the solution we have is the best possible one, and to think about things that are outside of the machine. So who is the user of this thing and what do they care about? How do I get them to take the action I want them to take so that I can get the data I need? Or all the classic sort of programming problems remain. The LLM doesn't remove all of that external stuff.
Yeah, it seems to me that too much attention has been focused on software development in the small, the coding aspect, just the coding aspect, right? Well, it generates code. Well, shit, so do our compilers, right? I stopped needing to write assembler language back in the early 70s. It's like, thank you, God of the compiler. Now I can focus on problems at a little bit higher level. And in some respects, to me, that feels like we're kind of doing the same thing, because yeah, it is tackling coding in the small, in the sense that given a specification, a prompt, right? Given a specification, the LLM can generate me, as you said, some starter code, right? Some boilerplate, a place to start. We are starting to understand. Those have been using it have understood for quite a while now, but we are starting to understand, I think more broadly as an industry, the quality of the code these things are capable of generating, which isn't 100%, right? I mean, that's one thing we found in our annual surveys of NSS grads in their use of LLMs, that a lot of sentiment that these things generate as much work as they take away sometimes, because the code they generate is either incomplete or it's got bugs, and so it takes a skilled programmer, trained programmer, to review the code and figure out what's wrong with what's there. And maybe the bigger challenge is to figure out what's missing. I was just looking at a study over the weekend, which was actually, it's another one of the GitHub Copilot. It's another productivity study survey based on users of GitHub Copilot. This is a pretty new one that just got released recently here, talking about errors in code being committed into repos are going up.
Mm-hmm.
Errors around application security, errors around, that there's just some holes in the code that gets generated. They're not as good about security. They're not as good about, right? So, so making sure that those whole, again, it takes a developer to do that. You can't, you can't go to the user who has the problem and say, you need, tell this piece of software the problem you're trying to solve, and oh, by the way, review the code and figure out if it's good. That dog don't hunt. So I think it feels like we're figuring that out. That still takes a developer. We're also starting to see some studies. I think this was one you're familiar with, saying that, and this one's very core to us. So maybe we shift topics a little bit, but there's other things you've said I want to look back on. That using the generative AI tools to generate code in a language you don't know, or for a platform you don't know, like if you don't know React, having it generate React code, that again is impeding people's learning of how to actually be an effective React developer, mm-hmm. right? And it's causing more errors to get generated. Mm-hmm. So I don't know how much. So anyways, I've said several things here. Just sort of want to get your response to some of some of these surveys say, and some of what we're seeing.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of truth to that, and I think there's a bit of common sense. Like we expected that, right? There is sort of a temptation that we all face, right, when presented with a tool like this, to trust it and to, frankly, be lazy. And programmers are the laziest people on the planet. And that is both a wonderful and terrible thing about them sometimes, myself included. And I think if there are students or prospective students listening, the thing that I would challenge them is don't shortchange yourself. Like, actually learn to program. Don't use the tool until you really understand what's happening, because it will limit your value in the future. People will eventually figure it out that you're committing what the tool gave you without understanding it or debugging it or making sure that it's actually the right implementation. And I think it would be very sort of tempting as a student to look at the fact that the job market is going through this turmoil and to think, well, I'm just a junior developer. But it's actually been my experience that NSS grads are a little bit more than just sort of the junior developer. That's not really the whole story about them. I think when I go into these large companies, sometimes I see people who've been in the same job, in the same company for 20 or 30 years. And one NSS grad in that team would be a breath of fresh air, because our graduates come to the table, they know Git, they know GitHub, they actually know modern technologies, package managers, they write tests. Like, there is a tremendous amount that an NSS grad walks in the door with that the so-called senior developers on the team in some of these companies may not have ever seen or ever learned. And so I think there might be a momentary hiring freeze, but I think NSS grads and potential grads should really start to think about what value they have and what they bring to the table in these companies beyond just, I'm a junior developer. And I think a lot of these companies need that. And that has very little to do with LLMs and generative AI. That's just actually knowing what the heck you're doing and knowing what the heck you're doing with modern technologies that all of these companies are, have ambitions to implement and roll out, that maybe aren't doing so hot at rolling them out. And maybe somebody who's just come out of a program where they learned those things and at a level where they take them for granted, right? I've talked to plenty of our grads who just, they would be shocked to walk into the door at a job and not use Git, right?
Right.
They would walk in and be like, I'm sorry, you're using what? And I saw that stuff firsthand. My job running this consulting group inside of GitHub was to go into these companies that bought huge numbers of licenses and wanted to make sure that they actually got the value out of them. So my team would go in and teach people how to use our tools, teach them to use them well. And a lot of these teams need a lot of help. You know, they've been stuck in place for 20 something years.
For 20, 30 or 30 or 40 years in some cases, right?
Yeah.
So, I think that's definitely one of the things that our grads just have no way to appreciate, right? They sort of think of senior developers as being being at the leading edge of all the technologies. And now they don't stop to think that, some of these guys have been working on the same application for 15, 20 years, right? Mm-hmm. And actually have not had the opportunity to use new tools and technologies, right? Mm-hmm. Because their organization's not invested in, back in those apps, which sort of begs a question. This is a little bit of a topic change, and I want to come back to some of the other things you've touched on. And that is with generative AI, which is, there's a lot of things to understand if you want to try to understand how to use generative AI well, right? There's a lot of traps. There's a lot of stuff about data that a lot of us have sort of had to think about for a bunch of years, for example, things like that. So I've certainly read some opinion pieces that one of the things that generative AI is doing is creating creating both an opportunity and a risk around the need to upskill. Mm-hmm. So much of our current workforce, our developers, and everybody in all of those surrounding positions, all the DevOps guys and test engineers and all the data people and whatever. What's your sense of that? And were you starting to feel there was an awareness of that out there and or an appetite for that? Where was that, again, allowing that we're still as an industry, we're still on the early stage of all this?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think there is a growing awareness that whatever sort of mistakes a developer might have made before, the LLM is even more likely to make them, because all the LLM has done is ingest code that other humans have written, right? And so I think, and this was not caused by an LLM, and I'm not betraying anything here because GitHub has made these kinds of things public, but over the last couple of years, GitHub has had some outages that were caused by their MySQL database being over capacity, not being able to handle the amount of traffic that was coming to it.
Right.
And they've done some really open and honest, root cause analysis and published it about what happened there.
Yep.
And in a lot of those cases, it was a developer who wrote some code, added some database columns, maybe a new table, without fully understanding the implications, the performance implications of the database architecture they had created, right? And nobody in the code review process caught that either. And then that stuff made it out into the wild. And then boom, database cluster is at its maximum capacity and then some, and site goes down, right? And that's not unique to GitHub. That happens to companies all the time, all over the world. If you just let the LLM write the code, how many more times is that kind of thing going to happen, right? But if the LLM is saving you time, now you can upskill and you could become a better SQL architect. And that kind of opportunity is that's where we actually get better software from using this thing. But we have to be deliberate about it. And I think for people who are early in their career or still going through training, maybe you don't have to be the world's like best Python programmer or the world's best Ruby developer. You need to be a good enough one, but you can maybe invest more of your time in these external systems that you're going to interface with and really understanding how they work so that when the LLM spits some code out, you're not just thinking about, does it function? You're thinking about, how does it function? What impacts is it going to have on other systems? Does it have nasty side effects that are going to take our site down? And I think that's always been aspirational for developers, right? And it's often what separates a junior from a senior, from a staff developer, and on up. But I think if you're earlier in your career, like it's the time to start doing some of that upskilling around programming. You will become much more valuable, much more quickly, and you have the time to do it because in theory, the LLM is saving you some time that you would have spent on some of the more mundane aspects of programming.
Yeah, on the mundane stuff, the boring stuff. Okay, so that's interesting, and I think there's a lot of interesting things we could talk about relative to that upskilling. That's one of the things we're looking at. I don't think I'm letting any secrets out of the bag here. One of the things we're looking at relative to our seekers is saying, while you're in your job search, come back to NSS and take some of these advanced beginner or intermediate level things that build on your foundation and learn about app security, learn more about data management, learn more about code design, higher level concepts of code design, right? Learn about refactoring, learn about more about test development and testing, right? Which are all these things that, again, lots of senior people have never had a chance to learn about it in a structured way. And it's going to improve your value and your ability to have impact and deliver solutions, even if the LLM is doing a lot of the coding, right? Mm-hmm. Because I think a lot of the discussion we hear about how the LLMs are going to eliminate coding, right? Or software engineering jobs because it's automating the coding, sort of betray a misunderstanding of what it is that software developers actually spend most of their time doing, which the lowest value add part may be the actual coding of 80% of the code. So anyway, so how would you think about adjusting the training if what we want is a job-ready junior, right? Who, it's sort of by definition, right? I mean, all bachelors of computer science look plus or minus a little bit kind of the same, right? Because the curriculum standards are all very similar, right? And yes, there's better schools than others and all that stuff. But still, the core curriculum for a bachelor's in computer science is pretty standard, right? The core, what an NSS grad learns to be job ready as a junior has been pretty standard for a number of years. How would you think, if you were running a dev team again today, how would you think about adjusting that core foundational training to be job ready as a junior, or would you? Do you still want them to know that stuff? Or if you would adjust it, how would you adjust it, right? Would you leave the core alone, but then add some follow-on stuff? Or, I mean, again, just sort of thinking about it based on what you've seen, and you had years of experience running a dev team, so.
Yeah. So I think a lot of what we did at CenterSource with early NSS grads was sort of give them the bigger picture over a number of years. And we had a great track record of people spending a couple of years working for us and then moving on and working at a startup or a big tech company or all over the spectrum, including we have several NSS grads who came through CenterSource that are at GitHub right now. One of them is in a staff position there. I think the core works. I think the core still works today. I think you really do have to understand that stuff at a low level. You have to understand how it works. You have to be able to pass a coding interview, which isn't going away. and you have to be able to pass it without an LLM tool.
Well, yeah.
Right. So you can't shortchange that. But I do think there's this sort of latent opportunity for NSS grads to present themselves less as a junior developer and to say, well, maybe as a programmer, I'm junior, but as a developer, I'm well-rounded. Like I walk in the door and I bring all these other skills with me that mean that I'm going to ask the right questions. Like I'm going to be valuable as a code reviewer because I'm going to be thinking about things that are outside of the code itself. I'm going to bring new tools and new processes into your team. And I think that is a much more powerful message to a hiring manager than, hey, put me in, coach, like I need a shot. And I think that stuff, some of it we already have in the curriculum. Some of it exists as follow-on programs, and I would encourage the students to take advantage of as much of that as they can. And then to, unfortunately, job interviews are a little bit marketing. There's a little bit of like self-promotion that you have to do to be a good candidate. And so I would encourage students just to think about all the other things they know and how they work that stuff into a resume and into a cover letter and how they say it out loud in a phone screen or in an interview and really impress the person on the other end of the phone, because our grads are impressive. They know a lot of things and they bring a lot of value into a team when they show up. And that's why we have so many repeat hires. That's why we have, alumni who are now in hiring manager positions who go in and hire NSS grads because they know, okay, sure, this person is maybe a junior programmer, but they have other skills. They learned things that are modern and we can build on.
Yep. Okay. We're pushing an hour, but I would like to hit a couple of additional topics, maybe a little, maybe these are more quick hits. And they're both related to either new developer job types or sort of evolutions of the developer job, right? We talked a little while ago, 25 minutes ago or so, we talked a little bit about we're not running out of problems to solve. There's in fact plenty of problems to solve. Let me sort of come back to that thought. When one position we've taken, I think we've talked about it in at least a couple of blog posts and a couple of other things, and that I've seen other people in the industry take, is that AI or generative AI, like many prior disruptive technologies, the internet, mobile, whatever, will actually increase the number of problems we can solve. It makes more problems accessible to be solved, and or it enables us to solve problems we've already solved, but in better ways, right? Both of which translate into more work for somebody, right? So that ultimately increases the demand for professional problem solvers. I won't say professional software engineers, but for professional problem solvers. I've, for 12 years, told our students, people are going to pay you to solve problems, not to be coders. And those problem solvers, we're still going to need to specify the requirements and the design of the solutions to these problems, as well as oversee the creation of the code by whatever or whoever, the testing, the deployment, all that kind of stuff. And those problem solvers may not be spending as large a percentage of their time on coding as developers have the last 10 years, but they will still but arguably, and we've talked about this too, they'll need all the skills we associate with professional software developers today. How do you feel about, in some respects, I think that's mostly stuff we've talked about. I'm just trying to kind of tie it together maybe in a different way. How do you feel about that vision of the evolution of, let's say, the application developer's role, right? So maybe not the system software programmer or but in most enterprises, most consultancies who are building applications for enterprises, how do you feel about sort of that vision of the next 5 years, the evolution of software developers' roles?
So I think for me, I have sort of dichotomy in my head about what software development is, in the sense that there is a discipline within software development, which is creating something new, something the world hasn't seen before. And honestly, the last couple of years in tech have been pretty boring in the sense that we haven't seen a lot of new technologies created. We haven't seen a lot of breakthroughs. It's been all about big tech. It's been all about the cloud. It's like, startup culture is withering on the vine right now, right? But I don't think that will last. I think at some point, particularly if we see interest rates come back down, there will be capitalists looking to put their money somewhere. And I think the startup culture will come back to us. And so I think in that sort of discipline, LLMs are almost a non-factor. Like, I think some of those startups might build models. They might be part of the product. But in terms of building the product, I feel like that still is very much, you're breaking new ground. And so the LLM is of limited use to you because it hasn't seen that problem.
It's never seen that. Yeah.
Right. And then I think there's this other like domain, which is supporting existing applications, existing technologies, things that are well understood, that have been in production for a long time. LLMs have a tremendous amount of promise there. And so I think that type of job is the job that's going to change. Being the maintenance programmer, being the person who's pushing new features into a mature product. LLMs in particular, one of the products that GitHub has out there right now is Copilot Enterprise, which certain levels of Copilot Enterprise, I will get into the licensing model. That's a different podcast entirely, but allow you to train a model on your own legacy code base.
Yeah, on your own code base.
And that kind of thing for a mature application can be very powerful. And so I think the developers who work in those environments are going to adopt this stuff. They're going to adopt it quickly, and their job is going to change, right? They're going to be thinking less about code and more about all of these other factors. I really, that first domain I talked about, which is breaking new ground, I really think that technology is nowhere near over in that dimension and in that arena. And I think that's another reason I would encourage NSS grads and students to really nail the basics, because there's still a tremendous amount of opportunity in that direction. Like, we're nowhere near solving all the problems we're going to solve with novel technology. And I personally, like, having had the summer off and having had a chance to reconnect with what brings me joy with technology, I'm excited about that, because I see that, you know, at the same time that LLMs are going to take away a certain class of problems from the mature tech industry, I think it's also going to open up some air and some space for people to go do new things.
Cool. Yeah, well, great. I think that's a very compelling vision that creates that speaks to opportunities for actually a wide range of different jobs for like our graduates, but also other people who are employed in this industry. Because we know that there have always been some people who want the stability, if you will, of a large stable enterprise, right? Who don't want anything to do with a startup, who don't want anything, right? And then there's others, who are attracted to the new, who are the builders, let's create something new. And there certainly are enterprises where both of those things go on, right? I mean, you mentioned the financial services sector. Certainly there's a lot of new that's been built over the last 10 or 15 years in that world, and more yet to build new, I suspect, as well as, we still got to keep the checking account system running and whatever. So, okay.
Yeah.
We've also, read and heard from some people about something that at least some people call an AI developer. And by AI developer, they usually, that this definition doesn't mean somebody who's building a foundation model, somebody who's using a transformer architecture to build yet another new open source. So what we all need is another foundation model now that has to be trained for a few millions of dollars, but rather somebody who is is building an application that is integrating in usually an LLM, right?
Mhm.
But again, when we say AI, I mean that could be integrating in machine learning capabilities, recommenders or whatever that have nothing to do with an LLM, right? Or it could be both, right? So, but it involves the use of all the libraries or a lot of the libraries associated. It may involve using like an open source LLM like Llama,
Mhm.
along with a RAG in retrieval augmented generation infrastructure, an NLP chat bot thing to attach
Mhm.
on to an API or an interactive interface to attach to the LLM's API. It may hide it behind a more traditional enterprise application, right? But talking about this AI engineer I think of it as more a skill competency combo than a whole new job type. But maybe it does become a sort of an identifiable career path. I don't know. What's your thought on that?
Yeah. So I think for quite a long time now, there's been an implicit assumption in software development that we have back-end server-side code
Right.
and we have front-end web browser code. There's still some old client-server desktop application stuff in the world, but for 15 plus years, it's all been in the browser.
Yeah,
right?
it's been pretty stable in that view of in the
Yeah,
browser, on the server. Yeah.
right. So I think that the LLM as an aspect of an application, to me, is a new type of front end. And so I think there will be a type of developer who is an LLM front end developer, who is integrating those tools. And I think there are whole classes of applications and data models and problem domains in which a visual interface is clunky or difficult. And one that I've been sort of personally playing with this summer as I try to keep my axe sharp, which I still do from time to time, is I've been working with some set theory stuff. And set theory, I mean, the default visualization for that stuff is Venn diagrams. And that is just so clunky and so ugly in the browser. And so one of the things that has popped up for me is like, hey, can I actually train a chat agent, whether it's an LLM behind it or something simpler, to understand set theory so I can have a conversation about it? And that's just one particular problem domain in which now we have a new thing to explore in terms of what the user experience and the user interface look like.
Yep.
And I sort of see LLMs kind of morphing into a user experience domain.
Well, that's kind of interesting because the LLM as a component actually lives on the server side,
Mhm.
right? And we talk to it via its APIs, or we talk to something else that talks to the LLM and then talks to us.
Mhm.
So it's interesting to hear you say that the LLM is a new type of front end. I think the LLM's generating needs for new types of front ends. That makes total sense to me. I'm having a little trouble wrapping my head around something as big as a foundation model in the browser. So
yeah,
so literally on the front end.
Well, yeah. No, I mean, I don't mean literally, right, that the model itself is in the front end. But what I mean is, let's say you have a traditional server-side application with traditional application logic and business rules and all of the stuff that you would hard code as a back-end server-side application. Well, LLMs are a new way to interact with that API.
Yes.
So an LLM can be taught what your application does and does not do. And then it can give you a natural language way to interface with that, ask questions about it, get information from it without having to go to a visual web browser interface, without having to actually generate API requests yourself.
Right.
And I think we'll see more of that.
Yeah. Okay, cool. Yeah, I think that's in the lines of sort of what I was talking about. It's a different, but it's definitely a different way to sort of visualize it. And I think I actually had a conversation with Susan Culkin,
Mhm.
who teaches a UI UX class for us and is one of the most experienced UX people in Nashville. She and I talked a little bit about what may be opening up in terms of new types of user experience possibilities, right? And the chat interface, but we got type chat, and now with some of the voice response on some of these things, some of it's already pretty impressive. And right, but I could see other ways, given that the LLM kind of to me, LLM sort of shine around unstructured data, right? And and so coming up with new types of interfaces to help us interact with and understand unstructured data. So maybe much more dynamic visual interfaces or 3D interfaces, because the whole glasses thing we keep trying. So anyways, I think there's a lot of interesting things coming there, maybe, Brandon. I don't know. But I agree with something you said earlier. Technology's not done. The LLM's not the end of the path. Um, this just gave us a new platform from which to build, to me. So, and I think in a way you're saying a lot of the same things. So,
Yeah,
all right.
I think as people who've been at this for a while, John, you and I both, I think there was a lot of excitement for 20 plus years around the promise of technology and new things, being new boundaries being pushed all the time. And the last decade or so, things sort of settled down for a bit. It was much more focused on building big businesses and mature companies, and that needed to happen. But I think right around the corner is another phase of innovation and excitement, and it's personally the reason that I'll still be involved in technology.
All right. All right. Well, speaking of Brandon and reasons you'll be in technology, let's do a couple of quick hits on Brandon on the way out the door here.
All
so, right. What's your technology guilty pleasure? I know you're into all kinds of technology in all kinds of ways. So
I actually asked my wife this question yesterday. I was trying to sanity check my answer, and we both agree that it's home automation.
Okay.
To a ridiculous degree. I didn't leave this at the top of the podcast, but in 2020, my wife and I bought a 122-year-old cure cottage in Saranac Lake. So it's essentially a mansion that was built for someone who had tuberculosis to come up here in the cool mountain air and cure, which today we know if they had simply invented the antibiotic, they wouldn't have needed to come here and breathe the cool mountain air. But that was the thing back when this house was built.
Right.
But because of that, it is a massive home, and it has hundreds of light bulbs. So I very quickly figured out that I didn't want to spend my time walking around flipping light switches. So I have gone way overboard on home automation.
Okay. Smart light bulbs. Okay. Yeah. All right. Okay, cool. So I also know you consume a lot of information in a lot of different ways, right? So, but I'm going to ask you this question in the form of a very old style of information consumption. But if it's not a book, feel free to hit me with something else. But what's the last book you read, or podcast you listened to, or Substack that you consumed that you would recommend to other people to check out?
Yeah, so I'll stick to books. I do still read quite a bit, and I'll give you two answers. One, just a very fun fiction read. It's called A Gentleman in Moscow. It's by an author, Amor Towles. Yeah. It was recently made into a very excellent television series starring, what is his name? I can't believe I can't remember that right now. Let's see. I can look at Ewan McGregor is in it. That's who.
Right.
But don't watch the television show until you read the book. It is really riveting. It's very fun. The other answer that I would give is I learned a long time ago that I need quick, short books that are an escape, where my brain is not working too hard on the book so that my brain can work on something else. And so over the last year, I've read every single Jack Reacher novel.
Oh, yeah.
They are very short. You can read one in a few hours. They are very fun, like escapism, and they're all stories where like the good guy always wins.
Oh,
and,
always wins.
And I think like however you feel about what's going on in the world right now, it is very satisfying to escape for a minute into a situation where the good guy wins.
Where the good guy wins and
Yeah.
inflicts a lot of pain on the bad guy.
Yeah. Yeah. And you know, I read plenty of tech books, I read plenty of business books, but like if I leave people with one thing, it's like don't make that your whole life.
Yeah.
Like take care of your brain, like have fun, read things that bring you joy and pleasure. And that's the best thing about reading is that you get this opportunity to escape to somewhere else.
Well, yeah, you get to go somewhere else. That's some people do science fiction, some people do the Jack Reacher books started to come out when I was still doing a couple 100,000 miles a year on an airplane. And I picked up the first one walking through Heathrow, changing planes from somewhere to somewhere. I don't know, but I knew where every bookshop was in every terminal at Heathrow. And so I ditched the book from the last flight that I'd finished and go get a new. And there was this big display of this new guy, Reacher, Lee Childs. And I grabbed it, and it was like perfect airplane books. And, you know, those became sort of my, Tom Clancy had been my go-to airplane books for years, but Clancy died. I sort of ran out of Tom Clancy books, and it's like, who replaces it? Reacher. So yeah, I told, and there is something about a series, right? There is something about the continuation of characters that you've come to know and whatever. So some of the
I think it's very much the book equivalent of what's happening in television right now, where you have these prestige dramas that go on for 6 to 7 seasons, and the literary world has been doing that for a long time. You can get kind of the same joy out of reading all the Sherlock Holmes books or all of the James Bond books, like just these little worlds that you can kind of get invested in the characers.
There's a lot of naval ones like that too. The Aubrey Maturin, the movie Master and Commander was based on a series of books. Those are, you can lose yourself in those babies too. So.
Yeah, I was just recommending to a friend last night, actually, the Alistair MacLean Guns of Navarone series, which I feel like a lot of people had seen the old Hollywood movies of those books.
Yeah,
they're fantastic books.
Yeah. Oh boy, that's a long. Yes, I kind of forgot. He has what was that book? HMS Ulysses, which is not in that series, is a very good book by MacLean. And I think that might have been his first book, but it was very good.
Is that the one about the North Atlantic convoys?
Yeah.
Yes, I have read it. It's awesome.
Yeah, excellent book. So, all right, Brandon. Hey, thank you for spending so much time with us. I really appreciate it. It's great to see you, even if remotely, because we don't get a chance to see each other anywhere near as often anymore now that you're up in the Great White North.
No, I've been looking forward to this, John. One thing that I know about our friendship is sometimes we have to make ourselves go to bed and stop talking. We're both capable of chatting for hours. So I'm honestly impressed. We got this done in an hour and 20.
Well, viewers of this won't be able to see this, but we do have Mandy sitting here giving me have you looked at the clock lately? Which says 1:19 and 42 seconds. So we're in great shape.
Yeah.
We're not even approaching Joe Rogan territory yet. So we're good. So, well, anyways, Brandon, thank you. I really appreciate you sharing your thoughts about this whole generative AI thing and about how the nature of our work as software engineers, software developers is being changed. And because again, you were really on the front line there for a couple of years with some of the earliest adopters of these technologies. So just really appreciate getting your thoughts, and would love to have you on the podcast again. I'll bet there's other things we could talk about.
There are. Yeah, I've had a good time today, and
Talk
I'm
cars,
definitely
we
open
can
to
talk
that.
trains, we can talk.
We can, yeah.
All
Yeah.
right. Thank you, Brandon.
All
And
right.
go shovel snow and hunker down for for the winter.
All right. Take care.
All right.
Cheers.
All right. And for all the rest of you, thanks for listening. You can find links for things mentioned in today's podcast in the show notes. Hear more insights like these when you visit NashvilleSoftwareSchool.com and listen to other episodes of Stories from the Hackery.